Trump wasn't focused yesterday. Trump was all over the shop yesterday. The reason why we seem to get a little bit of focus on what he said on the Tomahawks is that the media went in to bring up the key lines, but he was bashing Venezuela yesterday because, of course, U.S. covert operations are now supposed to no longer covert. He was bashing the Democrats over the shutdown. He was making false claims about health care. He was saying that illegal aliens are overrunning the United States. I mean, he was not in a happy place. And by the way, he's very worried about the No Kings protests that are taking place in the United States later today. And because he wasn't focused, you don't get that clarity, on that issue of, look, let's try to nail this down.
Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Wow, second Saturday in a row. We have to make this a regular thing.
All we need to get a life is my...
That's another way of putting it. I was trying to avoid that.
It's my interpretation, but a lot of things happened in the last 2 weekends, so we'll get into this. But we're here to talk about, of course, this meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, their third meeting at the White House that took place on Friday. So, Scott, just your immediate reaction when you watched this yesterday.
I think the immediate reaction is that it wasn't good, but it wasn't a disaster. And it was interesting. Leave Trump for the moment, because there's a lot to try to dive into because he was all over the map. What Zelensky said at the end is, well, he didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And I think, people will quibble with that in terms of saying, well, Trump has sort of backed away from making a commitment on the Tomahawks after giving these positive noises about Ukraine's strikes on Russia and how they were affecting the Russian economy. But why I found Zelensky's comment interesting is I think there's a wider context here, because I don't think Zelensky is just there to meet Trump this week. And I think the media may have missed that. Remember that the Zelensky-Trump meeting was only scheduled to be, quote, a working lunch for around about 45 minutes to an hour. Now, in the end, it was 2 hours. Put that in the context of that Zelensky was in D.C. for 2 days. And he was there, for example, to meet defense companies, defense firms, including, for example, Raytheon, which are one of the major American manufacturers of arms and electronics. And it wasn't only Zelensky who was there. There were Ukrainian officials that were there all week. And they were talking to Trump administration officials about sanctions on Russia. They were talking about the rare earth mineral deal, but what has now become the idea of a fund for Ukrainian reconstruction. They were talking to them about other forms of financial aid, either through the U.S. or through Europe. And they were talking to the Americans about, for example, support of drone technology through joint ventures, for example, or the American sale of weapons to European countries to give to Ukraine. There's a wider agenda that was there beyond the Tomahawks. And we still wait to see how much of that was successful. Although Zelensky hinted in his messages yesterday, if you look carefully, that that Ukraine's happy with developments there. We also have to look at the fact that Zelensky will now go back to the Europeans, and they will consult and they will talk about the next steps, not just maneuvering Trump, but about dealing with the Trump administration officials. And I think the big question here is not how did it go just with Trump yesterday. Where are we with the Trump administration, which I think is divided, continues to be divided on certain key issues like the Tomahawks, and can Ukraine and Europe get the upper hand with them, in part, depending on what happens with Trump and Putin over the next 2 weeks.
Well, let's get into Tomahawks. Scott, top of the agenda for Friday's meeting was to get Trump to agree to provide Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, or at least to get him to sell them to fellow NATO countries or the EU to then provide them to Ukraine. So these have been described as game-changing weapons. I had her former British Colonel Hamish de Bretton Gordon on the show, I think on Thursday, And the way he described them was pretty much game changer. They're the firepower that Pete Hegseth described he's willing to give to Ukraine. Not specifically those weapons, but they are firepower. They would very much help Ukraine in their mission to strike further into Russia. And of course, we've seen so much success with them targeting Russian oil refineries and how that cripples the Russian economy. But Trump had been considering doing this. He'd been umming and ahhing with it in public. And we kind of got the interpretation that he was more so leaning to say yes. But in the meeting, he said he was wary about dipping into the US's stockpile for Ukraine in the off chance the United States did need them. So after the meeting, Zelensky said that the president, he didn't say no, but he didn't say yes, as you pointed out. So Scott, when you're looking at this situation and after the meeting and during the meeting, how likely or unlikely do you think we're at right now with Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine? You know, is Zelensky going home having not gotten what he came for?
The key point here is the Tomahawks are still on the table. I mean, and that's, again, Zelensky's remark. He didn't say no. Look, Tomahawks were not even on the table. They were never on the table during the Biden administration, of course. In fact, just think about this. Any type of U.S. support for Ukrainian strikes into Russia was not on the table till the final months of the Biden administration. Now we do have U.S. support for Ukrainian strikes inside Russia. It's just a question of which missiles are going to be used. So already you're ahead. You're ahead of the game in terms of where you were with Biden. Now, what I think what you're saying here is what happens next with the Tomahawks. And I think the best way to do that is to break down why Trump took the position he did, as much as you can try to make Trump seem rational, yesterday. And I think there's probably three things that are at play here. The first is Putin literally got in his ear, right? And that's that Thursday phone call, which was from the Kremlin. It was not from Trump to Putin. It was the Kremlin asking for a chat with Trump. Now that's rare. On previous occasions, Trump's been the one who's asked for the call. Now, why did Putin want to have the call? And it's quite clear that what he said to Trump was, if you give Ukraine the Tomahawks, it will affect the U.S.-Russian relationship significantly. We're not going to be friends anymore. And it's going to make me angry, right? And so he's playing on that idea that even if Trump is upset with Putin, as he has been, over the fact that Putin will not negotiate for a ceasefire, let alone a settlement in Ukraine, Trump still wants to have that connection with Putin. And Vlad was sort of threatening to walk away from it. And then the Russians, what was bizarre is after Putin did all this chest thumping over the Tomahawks, don't make me angry, we could hit back, etc. Then there comes the story of the Putin-Trump bridge, that they bring out a guy named Kirill Dmitriev. And Kirill Dmitriev is one of the most significant Russians people may not have heard about. He's been a long-term economic financial advisor to Putin, but he also has been working with the Trump camp since at least January 2017, when he was doing back-channel talks with Trump's mercenary friend, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater. And so Dmitriev comes out on social media and says, wouldn't it be a great idea to have a bridge linking Siberia with Alaska across the Bering Strait? Now, other folks pointed out that this bridge was absolute nonsense, that it was like about 1,000 miles away from the main Russian rail link in the east, and it was about 500 miles away from the main rail link in Alaska. But they were going to have this rail tunnel that was put up there. And Dmitriev said John F. Kennedy considered it in the 60s, and this would be a sign of unity for our countries. And it's like, God, it's not exactly subtle what they were trying to do here. And Trump noticed it yesterday because a journalist asked him about it. And he said, I didn't know. Maybe, I have to look into that. It's like, okay. So Putin's given him the threat. And then they've tried to butter him up. And then, of course, what they said is, hey, let's have a meeting. Now, I said back in August, remember, Maddie, I said the final card that Russia will play with Trump when their backs are against the wall is they'll finally give him a face-to-face meeting. And at that point, it was to push back the sanctions because Trump was talking about tougher sanctions. And That meeting didn't go well in Alaska. It was interesting. There were officials who, on the eve of this meeting with Zelensky yesterday, and once they knew he might meet Putin in Budapest, they went out and they leaked what happened in Alaska, where Putin gave him this rambling history lesson about Rurik and somebody the wise and all these medieval figures, and Trump got ticked off with him, according to these folks. Like, I don't want a history lesson. I want you to give me my Peace Prize now, right? So we know that didn't go well in August. Now they're saying, okay, let's try to make it go well in Budapest. That was enough where Trump was reciting their lines yesterday in a sense of, if we give the Tomahawks, it can make, we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that. We can get to a settlement where we don't get to that. Second thing that happened yesterday is there's a division in this Trump administration that I talked about over this. And we know that this line of, and it's not just with Tomahawks, it's with artillery, it's with rockets, it's with air power, that people who oppose further support to Ukraine say, we need it all for ourselves. And we know one of those people is Elbridge Colby, who I think is Assistant Secretary of Defense or Undersecretary of Defense under Pete Hegseth. And he got Hegseth to suspend all military supplies to Ukraine in the spring using this line. Now they were restored and they've been further developed. But clearly, there's Colby in Pentagon. There may be figures in J.D. Vance. We don't know exactly where he stands on this. There may be figures elsewhere in the Trump administration, certainly his purported envoy, Steve Witkoff, who would be holding out against giving these. And so Trump reflects that when he says, oh, we keep them for ourselves. And third thing here is, Trump wasn't focused yesterday. Trump was all over the shop yesterday. The reason why we seem to get a little bit of focus on what he said on the Tomahawks is that the media went in to bring up the key lines. But he was bashing Venezuela yesterday because, of course, U.S. covert operations are now they're no longer covert. He was bashing the Democrats over the shutdown. He was making false claims about health care. He was saying that illegal aliens are overrunning the United States. I mean, he was not in a happy place. And by the way, he's very worried about the No Kings protests that are taking place in the United States later today. And because he wasn't focused, you don't get that clarity, on that issue of, look, let's try to nail this down. And I think Zelensky knew that. I think at the end of the day, Zelensky's smart enough to be able to read Trump after that disaster at the end of February. And the idea here is, look, let's not kick back against Trump. Let's not make a big deal that he hasn't committed to the Tomahawks. Let's play the longer game here, which is what Zelensky and Europe have been doing. And so, next week, those people who do support aid to Ukraine, including the Tomahawks, may edge Trump back towards it, especially if, and here's the key thing to watch, where has Putin screwed up consistently since February? By attacking Ukraine from the air as well as on the ground, hitting civilian sites, hitting the energy infrastructure. And what has Russia escalated this month? 6 sets of strikes on energy infrastructure because Putin is caught between trying to keep Trump on his side and trying to deliver a knockout blow to break Ukraine internally. Because again, I'll repeat this, I don't think Putin has got an open-ended window for this. I think for reasons we can go into, he's got 6 to 12 months. And that's why they're stepping up the attacks on Ukraine with the airstrikes.
Especially because, he had promised this summer of offensiveness. And of course, Scott, winter's coming. And there's an amazing article, I think it was a CNN article that was released this morning, and it was talking about how they don't have the luxury of shrubbery to hide behind these troops, and how, everything is open when you're in the winter. You can see the troops coming, and we know that they don't have the upper hand. But I want to just get down on that point that you mentioned, how Putin is involved in this Tomahawk missile stuff, and then we'll move on, because Trump said this about Tomahawks, right? He said they're very dangerous. It could mean escalation. A lot of bad things could happen. Hopefully we'll be able to get this war over without thinking about Tomahawks. It is a big ask for the US to either give or sell Tomahawk missiles. They have a $2 million price tag on each of them. They're one of America's best weapons. And the type of Tomahawks that Ukraine would need, the ones that are launched on land, not from the sea, are in short supply. So that's a reality. It is a tough task to send them to Ukraine. But when Trump uses the phrase, this could escalate the war, Scott, that is very much mirroring what Putin and the Kremlin have been saying. That's been their threat. They've said this will escalate the war if the United States gives this to Ukraine. So this resistance from Donald Trump in supplying Ukraine to missiles, is it about those details that I outlined? The price, how they're America's best weapon, how the stockpile is low, and how they need a certain one to launch from the land? Or is it more so that Putin successfully got in Trump's head in their phone call a few days ago? Did Putin get to Trump first?
No, the two interact with each other, Maddie, because if you think about it, we know that the Tomahawks have been under discussion now for weeks within the Trump administration. So we know that people are going to be scrapping over whether or not this should be done. And we know that those people in the administration know eventually you've got to try to be the one that gets the end with Trump, to try to spin him to your side. And as I mentioned, people like Eldridge Colby, we were back here in the spring with any type of American assistance to Ukraine. Now, at the end of the day, those people within Pentagon, within state, within the intelligence services were able to win out on that. They were able to get this provision, again, by playing to Trump's transactional side, which is, look, you're not giving these to Ukraine, you're selling this to NATO members who will then pass it on. So in the case of the Tomahawks, that is not what the tip-off here is. This is not a resolved issue amongst Trump officials. And that's why I say there's a longer game which is at play here. And that's why I was saying that everybody's focused on the Zelensky-Trump meeting. The Ukrainians will have been talking to officials across the American administration this week, right?
You think, sorry, Scott, to interrupt, do you think that when you say that discussion that they're having, are they discussing swapping for Ukrainian drones?
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. I think there's an idea here, which is we know that Ukraine has gotten this leverage with how far they've gotten with drone technology and the advance in drone technology. And again, who was Zelensky talking to? He was talking to U.S. defense companies this week, right? So you're talking about the sharing of that technology. So I think that idea, which is Ukraine as a defense partner of the United States, sharing that technology, talking about joint production, which helps beef the U.S. up. Because let's be honest here, Maddie, what you just said a moment ago before we got into this part about why the Russians are not advancing in the east and in the south. Let's be honest here. This is a breakthrough war in terms of the effect of drones on the battlefield. The reason why neither side is making significant progress is in large part because of where drones are. Well, the U.S. is going to want to be in on that. And so, yeah, I think that's why I'm saying that if a smart journalist out there would be going around to the U.S. companies and going around to other U.S. agencies to pick up the clues where we are with that. So this is going to play out for a while, but at the same time that you have that issue within the administration, then of course you get Putin, who puts his thumb on the scale here of that debate by thumping his chest. Now again, let's put this in perspective. When the U.S. was debating whether to send tanks to Ukraine, the Kremlin said, don't you do that. That's going to escalate this. We're going to come back and we might do something really, really drastic. When the U.S. was talking about HIMARS rocket systems, which are short-range systems or short-medium-range systems, Kremlin said the same thing. When it was F-16 fighter jets, Kremlin said the same thing. So at each stage, the Kremlin has thumped their chest and said, we got our own missiles, we've got our own stocks. Dmitry Medvedev has come out of wherever he is and then ranted about the fact that we're a nuclear power. And at each stage, the U.S. eventually has crossed that line, and Russia has not unleashed Armageddon. The thing about the Tomahawks here, Maddie, which brings, I think, all this together is, and this is where I disagree a little bit with Hamish. I love Hamish, right? But I disagree a bit with Hamish, is that I think they're not a game changer in that they're all of a sudden going to change that course of the war. I think they add to the pressure on the Russians from a military viewpoint because they increase the capability. I think the significance is it's symbolic. The very fact that the U.S. would do this and that Trump would do this, when we thought that Trump was going to go AWOL on this months ago, that's going to be a huge boost to Ukraine. And it's going to be a huge blow to Russia. So it's not like you need a massive amount of Tomahawks to make a difference here. You actually probably just need a handful of Tomahawks and a couple of successful strikes to really put the wind up to the Kremlin. And I'm not sure. I think that might be the landing point. I think that might be the landing point that the Europeans go into the Trump administration and say, look, let's just go in and go for a handful of Tomahawks. Let's talk about the launch systems, because as you mentioned, and this is really, really important, this isn't, you can't do it from sea-based launch systems. You have to do it from ground-based launch systems. And by the way, here's one of those coincidences that you should. Somebody leaked to the media this week that the Americans are about to unveil a new advanced launch system, which is capable of Tomahawk launches. So somebody is trying to say, yeah, this is possible here. Well, there's another clue that this is not an open and shut case.
Well, Scott, you mentioned how it would be symbolic. The other thing that Hamish said is that the act of sending Tomahawks to Ukraine is also just psychological, to say that we've got them. It's psychological to Russian troops, to Russia, that say, hey, we've got this very sophisticated missiles and let's see what happens. But I want to move on to land, because this was not so much spoken about in the meeting as much as it has been in further conversations that they've had. Here's what Trump said on Russian-occupied Ukrainian land at the UN General Assembly on September 23rd. So not even a month ago. Just a reminder to our audience that Russia occupies around 18 to 20% of Ukraine right now. So this is what Trump said. He says, I think Ukraine, with the support of the EU, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. Now, here's what Trump wrote on True Social after his meeting with Zelensky. Enough blood has been shed, with property lines being defined by war and guts. Then said they should stop where they are, let both claim victory, let history decide. He's essentially saying the war obviously needs to end now. Drop your weapons, lay claim to the territory that you have. Has Trump switched gears when it comes to territory and is now telling Zelensky he has to give up that 18 to 20% of land that was taken?
No, I think there's a way to play this out. Not necessarily that Trump has thought it all the way through, but there are connections here. Again, the advice is getting. Let me add another element that was leaked. I talked to you about that some officials, and I suspect they were American officials, leaked what happened in Alaska in August. Trump actually at that point, according to them, was going to Putin with the offer, which is, look, we will legally recognize your annexation of Crimea, right? In return for you halting the invasion. So what Trump was saying at that point was, all right, in effect, there's a freezing of the front lines in the east and in the south. So Putin does not get all of the Donetsk region, but he gets legal recognition of Crimea. Putin didn't accept, right? So at that point, what has happened here is Putin has kicked it back to Trump and said, look, I'm going to try to take all of Donetsk. Which and what muddied the waters here is that his Donald Trump's purported envoy, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, when he went and had those discussions with Putin without even a decent translator, when his translator was a Russian intelligence official, came back and started talking about how Putin was willing to make a settlement which did not include all of Donetsk, and the Kremlin came back and said, no, that's not true, right? So at that point, Trump, in effect, has had his offer rejected in August. So if the way I read that UN General Assembly speech was, he actually is kicking it back to the Russians and saying, look, you need to settle this now because I no longer think you're going to win this. I think you could lose this. And that puts the Russians back on the defensive. And that's what takes me all the way back around this, which is, I'm going to make a key point here, Maddie, which is, it goes well beyond what happened yesterday. The most significant thing right now is the Kremlin feels it is vulnerable. It feels it's vulnerable because it is getting hit by Ukraine inside Russian territory. and Ukraine hit a couple more installations overnight. So we're not just talking about one, two, three oil installations, gas pipelines, railway hubs. I'm talking about probably five, six, seven a week. And earlier this week, just want to highlight this, they hit the largest oil depot in Crimea, occupied Crimea. It's the second strike on that oil depot. They have destroyed 26 tanks now at that facility in Feodosia. And that is having an effect. That's limiting what the Russians can do, both in terms of consumer consumption of gasoline and the military support. And the Russian knows that. So from that sense of vulnerability, which is the combination of we are getting hit by Ukraine and we are not making a rapid advance on the ground, they find themselves in the position of that there's no easy option here. They either have to go back and concede to Trump. We're not going to try to take all of Donetsk. We're going to freeze the lines now. We are going to accept what we have. Or they have to press on and say, we want even more. And Vladimir Putin at every step here, when he has been faced with that difficult choice, he's played nice with Trump for a bit. And then he says, I want more. I want more. And I think that's going to be the tipping point for Trump. It didn't quite tip this week because Putin came in at the last part and said, no, let's meet again. But the next time Putin crosses the line, I'm not sure that Trump this time will give him a third meeting to try to save Russia's ambitions.
So, Scott, you're not looking at this situation thinking that Trump changed his tune again when it comes to conceding land. Because what I think people looking at this and people who aren't really across the day-to-day details, I think people keep looking at this thinking that perhaps we're back to square one on negotiations, because conceding land is one of the biggest arguments when it comes to what both sides want.
But here, Maddie, you got to remember, I'm a little bit different, and some of our Ukrainian friends will disagree with us on comments, and I fully understand why they disagree with this. That Ukraine can regain all the land, etc. My interpretation of where Zelensky, the government, has been for months now, and I would even say possibly going back into last year, is that the landing point for Zelensky and the landing point for the Europeans is a negotiated settlement which does not recognize Russia's occupation legally. So Russia does not get sovereignty over these areas, but it recognizes that the Russians are going to be there for the near future. Right. So what in effect, what you have is Russia will hold Luhansk. It will hold that 75% of Donetsk. It will have that portion of the southeast, like Mariupol, unfortunately, will be in their hands. And it will hold Crimea. And then what happens here is that Ukraine and Europe playing the longer game, then they build up the rest of Ukraine. They build it up in terms of its military capability. We've discussed that a bit. They build it up with Ukraine having this path to EU membership. They build it up in terms of a Ukrainian association with NATO, not membership necessarily, but an association with it. I've used this analogy repeatedly, so forgive me for using it again. It is a West Germany, East Germany analogy, roughly, in terms of what we had during the Cold War. And that is, you had to concede that East Germany would be in the Soviet sphere of influence, which it wound up, was the case for 40 years. But at the same time, you had a West Germany, which became one of the strongest economic powers in the world, and which had, the shield. It had the military shield of NATO membership. And I think, roughly speaking, that's where we're going to be. Hopefully not for 40 years, but at least for the foreseeable future.
What do you say, just to not wrap up the whole meeting, but I want to get your thoughts on this. There was a lot of commentary online about the timing of Putin calling and then the meeting with Zelensky. They're only a day apart. So, Scott, what's your thoughts when people say that every time Putin picks up the phone to Trump, he worries that the United States is about to help Ukraine militarily? He takes Trump's sanctions threats seriously. He somehow manages to stall more time, get another negotiation in place, whether he's present or whether his delegate is present. And we go in roundabouts, and Ukraine is hit with another curveball of whether or not the US is on their side. So what do you say to people that think that Trump and the United States are so vulnerable to these phone calls?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of Trump being in Vlad's pocket, and I've said that in the past, and I think generally that's still the case that Trump is beholden to Putin. Um, he had that personal connection, which even before he became president, how he wanted to meet Vlad, for example, having the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow in 2013. He's beholden to Putin over the Russian support that he got in 2016. So that's the case. And I think at the same time, I've always said it's not just Trump. You're talking about a Trump administration that's here. And I guess the way I wrapped this up, I said Putin threw away his chief asset. If Putin had settled this back in February with the direct U.S.-Russia talks, where he had said, look, to the Trump folks, look, I'll stop the attacks on Ukraine, but I want to get legal recognition of what I hold. He could have gotten that, as well as the lifting of the sanctions, and he wouldn't accept that. So what he did is he kept pushing. He kept pushing. I want more. I want more. And you know what it's with. Even with your friends, you keep pushing. Give me just a bit more. Give me just a bit more. They do have tipping points. And he ticked Trump off. He absolutely ticked him off. He ticked him off for two reasons, which I'll highlight. The first is he kept bombing Ukrainian civilian areas with those missiles and the drone strikes. And people kept going to Trump and saying to him, look, he's killing civilians. And who went to Trump? This is the thing that always sticks with me. Remember when Trump talked about it, he hit a nursing home. How could he attack a nursing home? And who told Trump that? It was Melania, of all people, right? And then the second thing here is that when Putin, we thought about Alaska. We thought, okay, this is it. Putin's played his card. He's got Alaska. Putin misplayed his hand in Alaska. That's what we're finding out. That he could have gotten a settlement with Trump where he could have gotten Crimea. He could have gotten a recognition, at least de facto, of what he holds. And he wouldn't accept that. And what happens, Zelensky and the Europeans 3 days later go into Washington and they get discussions of security guarantees. Okay, we fast forward to where we are in October. Putin has again manipulated Trump in the short term, right? But this isn't a short-term game. This is longer term. And so we go into next week, into the week after that. And Zelensky and the Europeans, what has impressed me most is that after Zelensky mishandled that meeting at the end of February, where he got ambushed by J.D. Vance and by Trump, he and the Europeans have been in close coordination every step of the way. And they've played this pretty well. And I think that's going to happen again. And don't underestimate, for example, I'll give you one name that almost nobody will mention today. Alexander Stubb. And we'll give our great viewers out there, you give them a prize, right? Token prize if they can tell us who Alexander Stubb is, the president of Finland who has played golf with Trump. And he was the guy who impressed on Trump back in August, to get back to your territory question. You can't give Putin the rest of the Donetsk region because it opens up the highway to Kyiv. He will attack again. So what they've done is they've put this in Trump's mind, which is that if Putin gets more than what he has right now, it isn't a stable settlement. And that is an advance to have that there. Now, again, the thing that is the caveat here is Trump is not stable. He's not stable because there's 5 or 6 other issues that are occupying him. And when he gets distracted, which he will this week, because the government shutdown's turning really, really nasty, then you can't guarantee that they keep Trump, in play. But I don't think you get Trump. What you're really hitting is, will Trump get back to the point where he gives Putin everything he wants? I don't think that happens.
So the days of February Oval Office showdown, those days are over. We're entering a new era where Putin has pushed Trump too far, but he's still trying to be a deal maker. He's still trying to be the one to broker his ninth war. Scott, I want to end on something that happened as well on this week and then into the meeting. So on Wednesday, Trump said that he had gotten Narendra Modi to agree to stop buying Russian oil. months after, of course, slapping India with a 25% penalty tariff for continuing to do so. Trump told reporters that Modi would halt purchases within a time. It can't happen straight away, claiming that this was a big step. An Indian government spokesperson said that these discussions were ongoing, so didn't immediately come out and said, yes, this happened, and said that the US had shown interest in deepening energy cooperation with India. Our consistent priority is to safeguard the interests of the Indian consumer in a volatile energy scenario. So then on Thursday, an Indian foreign ministry spokesperson denied the conversation between Donald Trump and Narendra Modi took place. So he said, I can say to the best of my knowledge that there was no conversation between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump yesterday. So that's a very interesting development of what is happening, because it would be a huge thing for India to stop buying Russian oil, cheap Russian oil. Trump then, in his meeting yesterday in front of Zelensky, he's told reporters that India is not going to be buying Russian oil anymore. They've already de-escalated and more or less stopped. They are pulling back. They bought about 38% of the oil and they wouldn't be doing it anymore. So I'm finding this very confusing that every single day, Scott, there is a new update. What is the truth here?
All right, so let's set context first because that's always useful, and then dig where we went here. Um, the Indians at the start of this year thought they had a trade deal with the Trump administration. So they will have been in contact with Trump administration officials about the details of that deal, which covers agricultural products, it covers textiles, it covers American manufacturing. For example, American automobiles, which the U.S. wants the reduction on Indian tariffs on that. That all came unstuck in April because India didn't thank Trump for, quote, ending a war, which is when India and Pakistan backed off of their confrontation. Trump took the hump over that and really wanted to punish India. And so now the talk was we're going to put tariffs on India. And then in the summer, there was the threat that Trump would extend the tariffs because of Indian purchases of Russian oil. Now, I mention that because Indian state refiners started to back off their purchases of oil at that point. There were several Russian tankers that were having to wait off the coast because they weren't going to be able to offload. At that point, the tariff on India was 25%. But what did Trump do? Trump raised it to 50% because he said India is still purchasing Russian oil. The Indians were absolutely furious about this because here they were quietly trying to pull back from the purchases of Russian oil, and they'd gotten punished even harder. And as I said, the way I knew this because I was talking to Indian media outlets. I do quite a bit of work with them. And they were reflecting the government's anger in every interview I was doing. And there was a delay in a U.S. trade delegation going out for further talks with India. Those talks have now resumed, right? And so it's like, okay, how do you pull back on this tariff with India that the Americans have staked out? How do you get back to the trade talks when Trump has said, stop buying the Russian oil? I think Trump got out too far. He got out too far in his skis. I think what has happened, if you decode the Indian statements, is they're saying, we've got contacts with the United States. We want to get to a settlement here, but we want to get to a place where we can continue to get oil. And they would like to get cheap oil because they've been getting Russian oil at a discount. So there may be speculation here, for example, where could they get that oil from? Directly from the U.S., from the Gulf states? Where could this be arranged? Because India is not going to completely cut off getting all this great Russian oil if they don't have something to cover where they're getting it from. I suspect what Trump did is he represented those talks that are going on behind the scenes as being, oh, I just talked to Prime Minister Modi who told me this. And that's when he went too far. I don't think necessarily Modi talked to Trump. I can't prove he didn't. But certainly the Indians then came out are denying it because what Trump has done is he's put Modi on the spot. And you don't put someone on the spot when you've got the talks that are still in progress. I think there'll be a little bit of repair work that'll be done because I don't think the Indians really want the 50% tariff on there. But this is national pride. They don't want to be seen to be caving to Trump. So they're going to have to figure out a way for Trump to shut up just for a little bit and give some type of space where everybody says, okay, let's pull it back to 25%. And India without making a big deal about it, starts to be getting oil from other suppliers.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report to break down this, another amazing, interesting meeting between Donald Trump and President Zelensky.
Yeah, well, thank you. And let's talk again when I can finally figure it all out.